May I remind members that social distancing measures are in place here and across the campus, and please observe these measures, including when entering and exiting the chamber. The next item of business is a Conservative Party debate on motion 23958 in the name of Donald Cameron on prioritising COVID-19 vaccination and economic recovery. Can I invite members who wish to speak in this debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Donald Cameron to speak to and move the motion.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I would like to begin by moving the motion in my name. As we gather today for this important debate, it is perhaps fitting that we acknowledge the sombre fact that earlier this week we learned that deaths from coronavirus in the United Kingdom surpassed the 100,000 mark. Over the last 10 months of this terrible pandemic, we have become used to hearing a plethora of statistics and numbers when it comes to the virus, whether in terms of positive cases, transmission rates, or infections. When it comes to the number of deaths, the sheer enormity of this huge figure is matched by the need to recognise that this represents 100,000 individual lives, 100,000 grieving families, and sorrows more numerous, more infinite than can ever be counted. It will be no comfort to those who have lost their beloved family members or their friends, but the future does hold some hope for those that are still vulnerable to the virus. For we now know that over 6.8 million people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccine across the whole of the UK, with just over 462,000 in Scotland using figures from today. Some 470,000 people across the whole of the UK have received their second dose too. We have 3 vaccines approved for use, with 2 in full circulation and the third due to arrive in the spring, and the last of those, the Moderna vaccine, showing signs that it is effective against the known variants of the virus. As was announced last week, the Army are working in close partnership with NHS Scotland to establish 80 additional vaccination centres across Scotland, with 98 military personnel working to have these sites set up and running before handing over completely to the NHS. These are all positive developments, and I know will be welcomed by everyone across the chamber. However, it remains the case that we are not out of the woods yet. In addition to the figure I mentioned at the start, according to the National Records for Scotland, 7,902 deaths have been registered in Scotland where COVID-19 was mentioned on a death certificate up to the date of the 24th of January. And 175,000 people have tested positive for the virus since the start of the pandemic. It is clear that the virus remains stubbornly high, and with the concern that new variants pose, it is right that we remain vigilant and continue to stay at home, protect the NHS, and save lives. None of us underestimate the challenges that the current restrictions pose for people across Scotland. As a father with 3 young children of primary school age, I particularly sympathise with parents who are having to balance work with looking after their children and ensuring they continue to receive a good education from home. And I also understand the frustrations of the many businesses across Scotland who fear for their future, and employees who do not know if they will have a job to go back to. And in the Highlands and Islands region that I represent, I've been contacted by many small hospitality and retail businesses who in many cases are not receiving significant financial support and fear that they may go to the wall if restrictions are not eased soon. We should also continually acknowledge the sacrifices that many who are shielding are facing. Whether it's loneliness, worries about going to the shops or to collect medicines, or simply a fear of catching the virus, this pandemic is taking its toll on many across our society. With that as a backdrop, and with all the uncertainty and anxiety it entails, it is therefore utterly baffling that the SNP government has now spent days, if not weeks, trailing its plans for a second independence referendum. After everything Scotland has gone through and is still going through, it simply beggars belief that this government thinks it right to talk about IndyRev 2 at this point in time. For some completely unfathomable reason, the SNP have chosen the middle of a global pandemic as the right time to serialise their never-ending obsession with independence. Not just unfathomable, but unforgivable. Let's look at the timeline of recent events. In September last year, the First Minister presented her headline announcement in the final programme for government for this session of Parliament. She said that before the end of this Parliament, and I quote, "We will publish a draft bill setting out the proposed terms and timing of an independence referendum, as well as the proposed question that people will be asked in that referendum." At that very time, the First Minister had herself announced significant new COVID-19 restrictions in 3 local authority areas in the Central Belt, and it was clear that cases were on the rise again. But instead, the First Minister indicated to Parliament that vital civil service time would be spent on not only drafting a new independence referendum bill, but that the Scottish Government would be focus grouping on its referendum question. Earlier this month, John Swinney told the BBC show Politics Scotland that independence is an essential priority. Fast forward to the middle of January, and the SNP announced it would be establishing an IndyRef2 task force, which it described as the final piece in the jigsaw that will help deliver independence. And then this weekend, the SNP made another proclamation by producing its 11-point roadmap for a second independence referendum, which includes a proposal to hold an unlawful referendum after the Scottish Parliament elections. All of this is not just breathtakingly irresponsible, but it flies completely in the face of what the people of Scotland want. Just last year, polling stated that the question of the Constitution was low down on the public's list of priorities, coming in at 7th with just 15% of people listing it. Unsurprisingly, more people cared about improving our NHS, improving our schools, and improving the economy than they did about the Constitution, even when the current pandemic is taken out of the equation. Government is about making choices, and to its eternal discredit, this government is choosing, of its own volition, to prioritise more constitutional division rather than the deep and pressing issues thrown up by the COVID-19 pandemic. One of those issues is the economy, and I'm sure that others on our benches will no doubt speak about the imperative to prioritise the economic recovery. However, I would like to concentrate on the vaccine rollout, which is where the immediate focus of this government should be. The fact is, the vaccine rollout fits a pattern where the delivery of important health policies during this pandemic has been poor. Over the last year, there have regrettably been a number of failures from this government over the course of the COVID pandemic. In many instances, the government has simply refused to take responsibility for these mistakes. All too often, opposition parties and the media have had to force this government both to apologise for its failings and to provide solutions to problems. On care homes, the Scottish Parliament twice voted for an urgent public inquiry to take place when it was found out that COVID-19 positive hospital patients were being transferred into care homes and other patients were being moved in without any testing at all, putting care home staff and vulnerable residents at risk. On PPE, the SNP have failed time and time again to properly protect our frontline NHS and social care staff. I don't need to remind members that at the beginning of the pandemic, over 1,000 Scottish care workers wrote to the First Minister to say, and I quote, "We do not feel safe at work. By not giving us the PPE we need and by not testing frontline workers, we are being forced to put not only ourselves, but our family and our clients at risk." And as I noted in the Chamber last week, BMA Scotland have raised concerns over protection against the new strain of COVID-19, stating, and I quote, "The currently recommended PPE may not offer the best protection in some clinical environments." And similarly, turning now to the vaccine itself, we are seeing real and concerning failures in the SNP government's handling of the rollout of the vaccine. The Scottish Government has had months to prepare for this moment. We all want, in fact, we all need the rollout of the vaccine to be a success. But on Sunday, we saw the lowest published figure of people vaccinated since the daily figures began, fewer than half the number of people that were vaccinated on Saturday. And last week, the First Minister effectively conceded that the SNP government's target of vaccinating 560,000 people by the end of January will not happen, saying that the target date has been refined, a convenient shorthand for the fact that timetables have slipped and the goalposts accordingly moved. We know that the issue is not one of vaccine supply levels, despite the Health Secretary's claims that vaccines were being back-ended by the UK government. The issue is one of rollout and of blockages in the system here in Scotland. And I'll repeat the remarks of the BMA Scotland GP committee that I referred to last week because they are important. That committee noted the variable and sometimes slow rate that vaccines were being made available to GP practices. We also know that BMA Scotland asked the Scottish Government's interim Chief Pharmaceutical Officer to consider allowing GPs to directly order the supplies they need to vaccinate their patients, effectively bypassing health boards. Now, we all accept the logistical challenges here, especially given Scotland's geography, but clearly something is not working. The views of our GPs and other healthcare workers are vital to this, but so too are the real stories of our constituents, and we will all have had these in our mailboxes. I've received some particularly distressing and worried emails from people right across Scotland. People feel they are in the dark. One lady from Perthshire emailed me on Monday to say that her parents are both in their mid-80s and have not yet been given a vaccination appointment. When she contacted the local GP to inquire, she was told that they did not know when they will receive more vaccines, nor how many doses would be available. Another lady got in touch with me to say that a 98-year-old family friend from Renfrewshire who lives by herself had not yet received an appointment. And only today, someone emailed me saying that they are 85 years old. 2 weeks ago, they received a text from their surgery saying they would shortly be called in for a vaccination. And since then, silence. But this person's wife, who is 77, has received an appointment for next week at a nearby community centre. These are the real stories of people who are being impacted by both the lack of information and lack of action. This is genuinely a postcode lottery between health boards, within health boards, and even within families. And it is affecting some very old, very vulnerable people and playing havoc with their hopes and expectations, given what is at stake. When those aged 80 and over and their families see others elsewhere in the UK being vaccinated, it is only right that they will question what is happening in Scotland. All of this points to a disorganised rollout process with no clear direction or leadership. It also does not bode well for the future when we get to the next priority groups in the coming weeks and months. That's why the Scottish Conservatives are today calling on the SNP government to establish a vaccine task force. Such a task force must have a primary focus on supply and vaccination methods throughout Scotland. The task force should ensure that supply is getting to GPs and other places that are administering the vaccine within the right timeframe. It should also aim to keep GPs informed of progress with supplies on a regular basis. It should also recommend on which methods are being used across the country to carry out the vaccination programme. This would allow for any gaps to be seen quickly, identify what methods are working best, and allow for best practice to be both shared and used. We believe that this is absolutely critical going forward so that we can ensure targets are met and, most importantly, that people are protected against this awful and deadly virus. In conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, the Scottish Conservatives urge the Chamber to support our motion today. It's abundantly clear that the very last thing Scotland should be doing at this critical moment in time is planning for a referendum of any kind, let alone one on carving Scotland out of the United Kingdom. People don't want an IndyRef2 task force, they want a vaccination task force. The people of Scotland want all of us to focus on rolling out vaccines, reducing the numbers of deaths and cases of COVID-19, and rebuilding our economy. Whatever your view in the constitutional debate, we urge the Scottish Government to pause, reflect, and realise what is at stake if we take our eye off the ball at this critical juncture in the pandemic. Now is not the time to divide communities all over again. Instead, now is the time to unite people across this country as we hopefully enter the final chapter of our collective struggle against the pandemic that has wrought so much sadness across Scotland. And I urge the Chamber to support our motion today. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call on Michael Russell to speak to and to move Amendment 23958.3.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. No one could doubt we live in very troubled and difficult times, and no one, Presiding Officer, no matter our political divisions, could fail to pause today and remember that whatever we are debating, The UK has passed a terrible milestone this week with 100,000 deaths. All of us must feel that, though of course not as much as those who will grieve for a long time. All of us must regret what has happened. All of us must work together to temper the lethal force of this pandemic in every way we can. And that is what we are all trying to do. Let me start this debate, however, from my contribution with a quote, in fact, two quotes. Yesterday, somebody told Good Morning Scotland that NHS Scotland is doing a tremendous job, as is NHS Wales, Northern Ireland and England. The vaccine supply has been lumpy and is the limiting factor on deployment by NHS Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And on Sunday, somebody else said on UK TV that this is a complicated manufacturing process. We're getting it in as quickly as we can from the two manufacturers. The NHS across the whole of the UK is supplying it and getting it into people's arms as quickly as it comes in. Presiding officer, the first of those quotes is from the Tory UK Vaccine Deployment Minister Nadhim Zahawi. The second is from the Tory UK Health Secretary Matt Hancock. And I want to thank those two Tories for saying those things. It is simply to be regretted that the Tories in Scotland are not saying them too. For they, like their colleagues south of the border, should be paying tribute at a time of so many deaths to all those who are involved in the monumental task of ensuring that every citizen who wants the vaccine can receive it in a well-ordered, carefully planned, risk-based programme recommended by an independent and respected UK body, which is being treated by all four governments of the UK as a matter of the greatest urgency and is being delivered with skill and dedication by the NHS in the four countries. But instead, alas, they're doing something else. Yesterday, I was told about a doctor's surgery in my own constituency, which has just completed the vaccination of all over 80s. When the next supply of vaccine arrives, it will start in the over 70s. Those who are housebound are getting home visits. But they have another problem. The difficulty of doing all that, given the constant phone calls from often vulnerable people who have heard some in this chamber creating doubts about whether they will get what they so keenly want, a vaccination that starts them back on the road to normality. And sadly, that distress and worry arises not from the programme, but from the discreditable approach we have just heard. I actually like and respect Mr Cameron, which is one of the reasons why I think his speech today was not at all worthy of him. He and his less reputable colleagues are, whether they know it or not, causing the distress, and in so doing, not producing a better vaccination programme, but actually interfering with the delivery of the existing one. No one's saying that any programme of this size in any country, Scotland or anywhere else, is going to be without difficulty. No one is saying that a programme of such complexity could not be and should not be constantly improved. Mass vaccination centres are up and running in a number of places and being joined rapidly by others. Rural and island boards are looking at innovative ways of vaccinating whole communities. Of course, there can and should be scrutiny and suggestion from this chamber. But there should not be a desperate politicisation of such a crucial matter by a sleek-it, anonymous Tory government source in London, aided, abetted and amplified, alas, by an unprincipled Tory party here. At any time, this government will always act in the best interest of Scotland's people and will work tirelessly to ensure their health, well-being and livelihoods. But there are times when that obligation lies not just on government, but on the whole Parliament. And this is one of those times, and it's essential that every member measures up to it. Presiding officer, data published today shows that NHS Scotland is now exceeding the 100,000 doses a week, which was the target for January. That's rising every week. And indeed, yesterday, more than 24,000 first doses were delivered. Numbers have risen 41% in the last week, just about the same rise as south of the border. But it's not a competition, it's a crusade. And we should be united in that, not divided. The Scottish NHS has vaccinated 233,681 frontline health and social care workers, actually exceeding the target of 230,000 set by the health boards. Over 95,000 of older care home residents have been vaccinated too. By early February, all residents and staff in care homes for older adults, frontline health and social care workers, and those aged 80 or over living in the community will have received their first dose. By early March, everyone in JCVI priority groups 1 to 5, more than 1.1 million people, will have had their first dose. By May, over half the adult population of Scotland will have received protection, accounting for over 90% of preventable mortality from COVID-19 in Scotland. We have already vaccinated a higher percentage of our population than most other countries worldwide, yet still the pace continues to grow and it will go on growing. But presiding officer, sadly, the pandemic is not the only issue the country is having to deal with. The pandemic is an external crisis, but there's another crisis that's been inflicted on us by the Tory UK government. The UK Tory insistence, backed by the Scottish Tories, on a reckless decision to press on with the end of the transition period for leaving the EU, even in the face of this unprecedented economic, social and health crisis, has caused, is causing and will cause untold economic and social damage. Now less than 4 weeks since the new trading arrangements came into force, problems are multiplying and spreading. The UK government calls these teething troubles, tries to pin the blame on anybody but itself, but the truth is the hard Brexit they chose has produced a hard outcome which will be permanent. It's likely that those exporting and importing will get more used to the paperwork, increased costs and delays. But the UK is now a third country. It will remain so, and therefore the trading arrangements will be those for a third country. That isn't an accident. The Tories took a deliberate decision to leave the single market, which we should remember is 7 times the size of the UK. The inspections, bureaucracy and paperwork are a result of that decision. A necessary flow of essential labour into Scotland will be massively reduced, and even tourist travel post-pandemic will be harder. There's now no access to some essential law enforcement tools that keep us safe. Our young people are shut out of the changing life experiences that Erasmus has brought. There are cuts in our agricultural budget, an end to monies that have helped develop communities, build infrastructure and support innovation. And the extravagant promises made to our fishing industry have been completely hollow. All of that during a pandemic. In fact, in the very midst of the worst of the pandemic. Presiding officer, responding to the pandemic in economic terms has been hard enough, whilst the UK government insisting on undermining devolution. Nonetheless, since March, we've committed more than 1.2 billion specifically to support our economic recovery, on top of almost 3 billion funding we provide in direct business support. Our programme for government includes radical and wide-ranging policies to help people, businesses and communities recover and rebuild. So, presiding officer, the government is doing precisely what the motion calls for. We are tackling the pandemic, investing in economic recovery, delivering a vaccination programme which is saving lives, and helping Scotland to return to some form of normality over the coming months. So why bring this motion? Well, presiding officer, out of the Tory fear of democracy. So at the very start of the Brexit process, the voice of the people of Scotland and its elected representatives have been ignored. And that experience leaves me in no doubt that when the pandemic subsides, our voice will also be ignored when decisions are made about how to build forward. Presiding officer, I believe, and I say it is in my view an unremarkable belief, that it is for the people of Scotland to decide what country and economy should be built following the pandemic. And that is why if there is in the next Parliament, a majority for an independence referendum that would allow us to become a normal small state within Europe, living in harmony and equity with our neighbours, then I believe that Parliament has an absolute right to take the matter forward. That's democracy. And no matter what I think of the current UK government, I do not think that in the end it will wish, after the pandemic, take not just the Scottish government, but the voters of Scotland to court to try and cancel out their democratically expressed wishes. The actions of the Tories in bringing this debate today are not very creditable, but I don't think that even they would wish to be seen to be going that far. So, presiding officer, I move the amendment in my name, confident democracy and decency should and will prevail.
Point of order, Mike Rumbles.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I know that in your role as Deputy Presiding Officer, you attend the Business Bureau, and I wonder if you could mention at the Business Bureau that there are MSPs such as myself who find it unhelpful to a debate of the Parliament. I know it's not breaking the rules because everybody's entitled to, the opening speakers are entitled to speak remotely, but it's helpful to the debate if we could have opening speakers who are privileged because they have a very substantial amount of time to make their points, and they are making them without the fear of taking interventions. It would be helpful to have a proper debate if that could be raised at the Business Bureau.
Thank you, Mr. Rumbles. It is a matter for yourself to raise with your business manager and for business managers to take forward to the Bureau if they wish to make suggestions around that matter. The procedures that we're following today are those which have been agreed by the Bureau, and there are indeed speakers from across the parties who are taking part this week remotely. And on that basis, I now call on Monica Lennon to speak to and move Amendment 23958.2.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. COVID-19 is a vicious virus and it doesn't care about politics or the Constitution. It is a virus that harms and kills regardless of your opinion, and it has cost people their lives, their livelihoods and their health. More than 100,000 people in the UK have lost their lives. That is not a milestone, it is a national scandal and a human tragedy. All along, Scottish Labour has been calling for swift action and for lessons to be learned. We have been failed by our governments who have been too slow on lockdown, too slow on PPE, too slow on testing and tracing. We cannot be too slow on the vaccine rollout. Getting Scotland vaccinated should be uniting this Parliament. That's why it is so disappointing that the Scottish Conservatives are using precious parliamentary time to raise constitutional issues. Parliament should be focused on scrutinising the SNP government's COVID response and improving it. We badly need a plan to eliminate COVID and safely ease restrictions. People in our country want to be brought together. The priority for all of us needs to be getting the vaccine into people's arms. That is what the people of Scotland want to see action on. So let's look at some facts. We're almost in February, but half of Scotland's over 80s are still waiting on their vaccination. In comparison, almost 80% of over 80s have been vaccinated across the UK as a whole. So why are we lagging behind, and when will we catch up? At the current rate, we're on track to miss the mid-February target by over 250,000 people. Now, we know that GPs are experts in vaccinating people, but they continue to raise concerns about complex layers of bureaucracy. Access to vaccines needs to improve. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretaries to commit to simplifying the distribution process and let GPs order the vaccine directly, because that's what's happening elsewhere. Our country is in the grip of its worst crisis since World War II. This is a time for politicians to come together and work collectively in the national interest. Every week that passes is yet another week of pain for people, communities and businesses. We know our economy is facing a deep, deep crisis. The staff involved in the vaccine rollouts are working extremely hard, and they deserve our thanks and support. We have people ready and willing to vaccinate, as well as people ready and willing to be vaccinated. So we need to pick up the pace so that the vaccine wins the race against the virus. Presiding Officer, the amendment in my name calls for 24/7 access to vaccinations as soon as possible. The Scottish Government said that they will pilot a 24/7 vaccination service. But when will they realise there is an urgent need for speed here? Not more pilot schemes and not more task forces. That's why we don't agree with the Tories today. The virus doesn't sleep. We just want to remove barriers to access. My amendment also calls on the government to publish an exit strategy from lockdown to effectively suppress the virus in the long term. The clear priority is vaccinating as many people as possible, but that's not the only thing the public need to hear right now or see from the government. All of the evidence so far suggests there is much to be optimistic about, and that vaccines will indeed reduce transmission as well as the worst effects of the virus if and when people still contract it. But it's not enough for the government to solely rely on the vaccine rollout as an exit plan. But I urge ministers to tell us, when will we have a comprehensive strategy for how to contain the virus and prevent another return to a devastating lockdown? At the weekend, as Deputy Convener of the COVID-19 Committee, I attended the committee's citizens panel and heard from people right across Scotland who had detailed questions about both the vaccine rollout and an exit plan from lockdown. That is what people want to hear us addressing in detail, not to use precious parliamentary time to rehearse arguments about the Constitution. Alongside speeding up the vaccination programme, we need an expansion of mass testing, more resourcing for contact tracing, and urgently enhanced PPE for frontline workers, especially those doing health and care jobs, but others on the front line too, to protect them against emerging variants of the virus. I wrote to Jean Freeman about it last year, I spoke in the Chamber about it last week. We need to take a precautionary approach on PPE, and once again I urge the Scottish Government to heed the concerns of frontline staff. Now, the motion title mentions economic recovery. We do need to take action to invest in PPE, test and protect, and roll out the vaccine so that we can get the economy moving again. We're still not using our full daily testing capacity, so we're missing opportunities to hunt down the virus and keep people safe. Too many people are still being forced into workplaces and not being kept safe. Financial support is not reaching people and businesses quickly enough. Life before COVID-19 was hard for too many Scots. Almost 250,000 households across Scotland were already struggling at the point the pandemic started. Life has got even harder as a result of the virus and our response to the virus. The effect of COVID-19 has been devastating on so many lives and livelihoods, and we must take action to get money into people's pockets, protecting jobs through a people's recovery, because we can't go back to unequal Scotland from before. We have the powers to do this, and we will achieve it by getting on with the people's priorities, vaccinating the population, not spending more time on the Constitution here in Parliament. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, the challenge facing us remains great. The priority must be getting Scotland vaccinated. To do that, the Scottish Government needs to work constructively with those in the front line and with other parties who want to contribute to the national effort. We need an honest assessment of our progress, not an insistence that there are no issues to see here, and we need urgent action to streamline access to the vaccine so that it can get into people's arms as quickly as possible. That is the mission the people of Scotland want us to focus on. It is a mission I am determined we fulfil. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. I now call on Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. This pandemic has knocked this country sideways. 100,000 lost lives, grieving families, broken friends. Unemployment is skyrocketing. Children have lost out on precious education. Thousands are waiting an age for hospital treatment. Waits for mental health support were already long, but are now intolerable. It will take all our combined efforts, our ingenuity, our commitment to recover from this pandemic. It will take our undivided attention, our needle-sharp focus. So it beggars belief that anyone, even the most committed and dedicated supporter, anyone should even suggest that now, as we start to plot our recovery, that this country should turn our attention to another independence campaign and referendum. We know what it was like last time. All-consuming, divisive, costly. With Brexit, we have an even more recent example of just how thorny, complex, prolonged, divisive and costly independence would be. Independence would be even worse than Brexit. Young people who are desperate for work can't wait for that. Children in need of a good education can't wait. People desperate for a hip operation or mental health support, they can't wait. Businesses on their knees cannot wait. They cannot afford to wait whilst the SNP have yet another campaign on independence. We've had a hell of a time in the last year. The last decade has been divisive. So let's make the next decade about not just what unites us, but also about what makes our lives better. Let's put the recovery first. Now, I was going to compliment Mike Russell and say that he would be missed from this Parliament, but then I heard that diatribe earlier on, and I'm afraid to say I cannot compliment that. To say that somehow the problems of the vaccine rollout were either the manufacturers, the care homes because it takes longer, or the opposition for daring to ask any questions, I think is not worthy of Mike Russell and his contribution to this Parliament over the years. But the government is increasingly evasive and secretive. Take yesterday. I asked John Swinney about the number of vaccines in storage. In reply, I got a description of the ordering process for GPs. But trust in the SNP on the vaccine programme is rock bottom. And it is not me that is generating it. I can tell you from my inbox that it is not me. People are genuinely concerned because they see the numbers. 140,000 vaccines behind England. England is speeding up. We are slowing down. For a government who frequently points out how useless Boris Johnson is, this is a terrible record. I honour to take an interview.
Marie Goujon.
I thank the member for taking the intervention because I just have to counteract some of the nonsense that is constantly coming out in the chamber in relation to supply and delivery and comparing us to England and to other parts of the UK, where we've followed a different path in terms of how that's done. You're not comparing like with like when you compare it in that way. And to say that we're not transparent, I think, how often has the Cabinet Secretary communicated with all MSPs all information about deployment? We're more transparent in terms of the information that we publish. So I think, while Mr Rennie may not like the answers that he's been given, we've got nothing to hide here. Those are the answers.
Willie Rennie.
There are lots and lots and lots of words, but there are very few facts that come from the government. Give an example of the care homes, which the Minister has just referred to. There are only 30,000 care home residents in Scotland, but we are 140,000 vaccines behind. So it makes no sense whatsoever what the Minister has just talked about. Do not blame the care homes for this government's failure to get the vaccine rolled out. Currently, GPs have once a week slot to submit their order to a local health board. The local health board then passes that on to the national organisation. The national organisation then passes it on to Moviento, the distributor. Eventually, Moviento get the vaccine back to the GP. That's 2 extra layers of bureaucracy, which do not exist in England. Perhaps that might be one of the reasons why the government is way behind on access to the vaccine. The BMA confirm this. They say they want direct access to the ordering process. They say we're having to go through quite a convoluted procurement process to get that vaccine into our fridges. 2 weeks ago, the Health Secretary said that she had 200,000 vaccines in storage. This week, the UK government say it's nearer 500,000. The Scottish government dispute that. But will they tell us what the number is? So much for openness from this government. So please end the secrecy. Tell us the number. Reform the ordering system so we can catch up at last. Last week, I asked the First Minister why the government was always behind the curve on testing. The response was to ask me why she would want to be behind the curve on testing. More evasion. And it's a serious issue. Because if you look at what's happened, the government refused to test students before outbreaks on campus. They refused to test at airports before holidaymakers brought it back in from abroad. Refused to test like Liverpool, claiming that it was only a political stunt by the Conservatives. And most devastating of all, refused, despite repeated requests from me and many others to the First Minister at the time to test new care home residents before they were admitted. Why is this important? Because the government must catch up on testing. And the first thing it must do is fully use the 65,000 PCR tests that it has at its disposal, rather than wasting 50,000 every single day. The government is even getting it wrong when it's giving away money. Last year was astonishing. I give them full credit and compliments. Money was delivered to businesses with speed. It was a great success. Now the funding schemes are delayed. They're full of holes with complex criteria. Too many are missing out. Self-caterers, guest houses, the supply chain, all missing out on what they truly need. And it is taking an age to get them the money. The government have taken far too long to develop the schemes. They announced them several times, but many are still not open for application. Businesses are on the edge. The good work of last year is about to be undone unless government moves faster. Whether it's on vaccines, on testing, on business, the challenges for this country are considerable. They need our undivided attention, not another divisive, distracting, costly and exhausting campaign on independence. Let's put the recovery first.
Thank you. I now call on Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Conservatives could have brought a motion for debate that was purely about the COVID response, and they might well have found that they could win majority support for such a motion. But they brought one which is about the relationship between COVID and the independence question. I suspect most people would agree that it would be wrong and unwelcome to most voters to hold a referendum on independence in the middle of a pandemic. But of course, the Scottish Government is saying it should happen after the pandemic, and I think that's as it should be. It's equally clear, though, that there is a simple democratic principle at stake, that the people of Scotland have the right to decide when they are ready to revisit this question, and that if they express that readiness by electing a pro-independence majority to this Parliament in May, their decision should be respected, and the question of independence put to them in a referendum recognised by both sides. No party and no government should stand in the way of that democratic process. Maybe the Conservatives simply long for a repeat of their 2016 election theme, to be the party which talks incessantly about independence while simultaneously demanding that nobody should be talking about independence. I don't think it will take them very far this time, because while the immediate COVID response is indeed a matter for the moment, and must, for better or worse, be dealt with under the limitations of devolution and in the face of a UK government which has nothing but contempt for this Parliament, COVID recovery, on the other hand, will be a long-term agenda, and Scotland has the right to decide what level of self-government will be needed for that long-term recovery. I do understand the frustration the Conservatives are displaying. They look at the two governments, and I imagine they find it hard to understand why most people in Scotland have such a low opinion of their Prime Minister, but don't have the same view of the First Minister. Because after all, both governments have made some of the same mistakes on the timing of lockdown measures, care homes, on mass testing, on school exams, and on international travel. They've made some of the same mistakes. Perhaps the answer is that people in Scotland know that mistakes have been made, but simply want clarity and honesty from politicians who admit those mistakes, which the First Minister did today, unlike the Prime Minister who claimed this week that everything that could have been done was done. We all know that isn't the case, just as we know that no government could have been expected to get everything right. More clearly, I think the different levels of trust are because people want politicians who appear capable of expressing genuine empathy and who can routinely speak in whole sentences. This should not be a high bar in politics. Those who will never support independence regularly condemn what they call nationalism, but in Scotland that word is too often taken to mean supporting independence. Of course, many who support independence do identify as nationalists, but the words are not equivalent. There are nationalists on both sides of the constitutional debate. And equally, there are people who reject nationalism, Scottish or British, but who are clear about their view of our constitutional future. It's the UK which has been most clearly in the grip of nationalism in recent years, seen most obviously in withdrawal from the European Union, an act which internationalist Scotland rejected and continues to reject. The UK government showed no willingness then to put divisive constitutional change on hold because of a pandemic. But while independence campaigning here has been on hold, the UK's nationalism is still seen in the midst of COVID. From Downing Street's attempt to have little tiny Union flags stamped on every bottle of vaccine, to the British exceptionalism of ministers who've claimed the fruits of inherently international scientific research as though it's some kind of proof of national greatness. This tendency is seen in trivial issues, like the sight of a UK minister announcing that British fish are happier fish. It's also seen in deeply serious matters, such as the vaccine programme, where all eyes seem to be focused on any variation in the domestic rollout, and none focused on the urgent need to ensure that the world's poorest countries can access vaccines at all. Compare this with Norway, working with the EU, despite not even being a member state, to become one of the world's first countries to share vaccine with the countries that need that international help. Presiding Officer, Greens will continue to press both the Scottish and UK governments to step up their action where we think their COVID response falls short. We will continue to assert Scotland's freedom to choose our own future as the democratic right of the people who live here. And while I support independence without calling myself a nationalist, I caution those who oppose it, but who have apparently nothing to offer in contrast except for British nationalism. Because though I believe that given that choice, Scotland would choose independence, we deserve better than the false choice of one nationalism set against another. We deserve, and I believe we are capable of, far better than that, as we ask ourselves what kind of country we want to be, what kind of country we will rebuild in the COVID recovery, and what role we want for ourselves in the European and international community. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. We now move to the open debate, and I call on Brian Whittle to be followed by Shona Robinson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A fanatic is someone who can't change their mind and won't change the subject. The SNP are clearly never going to take a referendum result against independence as a settled will of the Scottish people. To the SNP, a referendum result is only acceptable when it's the one they want. If it's not, then the public were sadly mistaken and simply must be asked the question again and again until they get it right. With the best will in the world, Presiding Officer, defeating COVID-19 is both immediate and important to Scotland's future. And I defy any MSP in this chamber to tell me that ramping up a constitutional debate should be a bigger priority for Scotland's government than protecting its citizens' health and livelihoods. Of course, the SNP feel the time is right to expend political energy and public funds in splitting up the United Kingdom. But then, the SNP, the time is always right for that. But when we are seeing Scotland fall behind the other nations of the UK with vaccinations, when businesses large and small are struggling to secure financial support to survive, focusing on anything other than getting through the pandemic and rebuilding our economy is quite frankly beyond irresponsible and highlights once again this government cannot distinguish between national priorities and nationalist priorities. I'll take the intervention from the Minister.
Mary Goujon.
I'd just like to ask the member then, in that case, if the sheer priority and rightly should be tackling the pandemic, how can he explain his party's focus on Brexit in the middle of a pandemic?
Brian Whittle.
Because the actual vote for Brexit was before the pandemic and the timetable was already set out. This is not about denying the SNP their right to believe that Scotland should be independent. It is about the SNP recognising that while it will always be their first priority, that doesn't automatically mean it's Scotland's first priority. As the First Minister has so often said in her daily briefing, we're in the middle of a pandemic, dealing with a deadly virus. If, as she has often said, the virus doesn't take a day off, why does she think it's acceptable for her government's civil servants to spend time drafting a referendum bill? Why does she think it's acceptable for her ministers to be focused on anything other than dealing with the pandemic and helping restore Scotland's economy and public services in its aftermath? Every politician here has stories from worried constituents, worried about when they or their loved ones will have a vaccine or access to a test. Prior to the pandemic in this chamber, the shortage of NHS staff was continually highlighted. Hundreds of GPs, thousands of nurses and midwives short, a shortage of consultants, of mental health clinicians. That crisis has been starkly highlighted and exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Where's the 11-point plan or task force to deal with that ongoing crisis? The worst drug death rate in the developed world, over 3 times the rate of the rest of the United Kingdom under the same regulations. Only now, after 14 years, dragged into this chamber, has the Scottish Government decided to take notice. Call me a sceptic, but I wonder if that has more to do with an upcoming election than it has to do with any real attempt to deal with the crisis. I know that last night we heard that deaths due to homelessness sit at twice the rate of the rest of the United Kingdom. Where is the plan to tackle that? A mental health crisis in our schools with CAMHS waiting times far too long before COVID, which are only growing ever more through this pandemic. Where's the big plan to deal with that? Presiding Officer, businesses will be the backbone on which recovery must be built. Even before the pandemic, the SNP were failing in Scotland's economy. Their half-hearted approach to supporting businesses and entrepreneurship has always been a letdown. They are certainly no friend to the business community. Even the Scottish Government's own advisory group on economic recovery recognised the need to improve relationship with Scotland's business community. But time and again through this pandemic, we've seen the consequences of Scottish Government's failure to work with businesses large and small. New business grants are continually announced to great fanfare, followed by an interminable wait for those seeking grants as the new funds and guidance grinds its way through the system. It's not unusual for the Scottish Government to overpromise and underdeliver when it comes to support for business, but it's never been less forgivable. Yet, the SNP launched their 11-point roadmap for a second independence referendum at the weekend. How about consideration of a task force to plan the roadmap out of COVID restrictions as vaccination programme protects more and more of our most vulnerable citizens? I asked the Deputy First Minister this very question yesterday. No answer, no plan. How about a plan to give access... I
encourage Mr Whittle to conclude this.
I thought I had 6 minutes, sorry. Sorry, how long have I got, Deputy First Minister?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. My apologies.
How about a plan to give access for loved ones to those residing in care homes as the most vulnerable are vaccinated? No answer, no plan. Education was supposed to be the Scottish Government's priority. Judge me by my record, said Nicola Sturgeon at the beginning of this parliamentary term. Didn't take long to ditch the flagship education bill as we see inequalities and the attainment gap continue to grow. No task force, no 11-point plan. Presiding Officer, the calls from the SNP for independence is a smokescreen to distract the people of Scotland from their woeful track record in government. And I saw Mike Russell bullishly suggest that the SNP hold its own referendum and dare the UK Government to challenge them in court. Now, I would have thought that the inside of a courtroom would be the last thing this Scottish Government would want, given its recent events. The ill-fated "the state is watching you" named persons bill defeat in court. And, of course, their own former leader and First Minister Alex Salmond has dragged them through the court to another embarrassing defeat. And that saga rumbles on. But at least the SNP will be on first-name terms with all the court officials by now. Presiding Officer, the SNP know they can't defend their domestic record. They know they have no cards to play, so cry independence in the hope it will galvanise their support and deflect away from their appalling record in government. The irony is, the very people they pretend to represent with this reckless policy are the very ones they're going to let down the most, because, Presiding Officer, Nicola Sturgeon, Mike Russell et al. Actually know there will not be a referendum in 2021, because to spend any money and time on anything other than post-COVID recovery is unthinkable. Post-election, they'll spin up their next cock and bull story, anything to get them through this election. The more they push this agenda, the less the SNP act like a government and more like a protest group. Scotland deserves and needs so much better. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I call Shona Robson to be followed by Alec Rowley.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. A year ago to the day, China reported its first death from coronavirus, and no one knew then how quickly the virus would spread, how quickly it would become a global pandemic, and of course the tragic effect it would have on so many people's lives. And today is a solemn reminder of just how many lives, something that should surely unite us even briefly. And it's not been easy for anyone, and the response not only here in Scotland but globally has evolved as our knowledge of the virus has grown. And I do sincerely believe that all have done their best to combat and tackle a threat of unimaginable proportions that no one could have foreseen. And of course, I want to pay particular tribute to those on the front line of the battle against COVID-19. I believe the Scottish Government has always tried to follow the evidence, such as the decision to follow the JCVI priority list for the first phase of the vaccination programme, which has been drawn up by independent experts to provide the greatest possible protection against preventable mortality from COVID-19 by vaccinating those residents and staff in care homes first, now standing at over 95%. And of course, they're on track to deliver the first vaccine to all those over 80 by the 5th of February, surely something to be welcomed. Donald Cameron talked about the importance of the views of GPs, but then conveniently forgot to mention, because it doesn't suit the narrative, the comments of Dr. Andrew Bewis, chair of the BMA GP committee, who said, "I believe our plan is good. COVID-19 vaccination is not a sprint. but a long-distance race. And of course, he is right. Will mistakes have been made? Undoubtedly, and I'm sure we'll learn from them. But to listen to the opposition, you would think that every single thing that the Scottish Government has done has been a disaster. Never any praise for the successes, not one. Something not lost on our hard-working health and social care staff. The Scottish Government has quite rightly committed to a public inquiry to learn lessons from this pandemic and to ensure that we are better prepared for any future public health crisis. Turning to the motion before us today, frankly, it's difficult to know where to start. Confused, muddled, simply undemocratic spring to mind. It's also terribly hypocritical. It appears to confuse the setting up of a task force to explore and promote independence by a political party, present to voters ahead of a democratically scheduled election as the actions of a government, while at the same time presumably believing it's okay for the UK Government to have set up a special union committee chaired by Cabinet Office Minister Michael Gove, which has been set up in addition to a union unit at number 10. So the Tories are now setting up a committee at the heart of a government to fight against Scotland's right to choose independence. No mention of this being a distraction from the UK Government fighting the pandemic in the Tory motion today. It says that there should be no discussion on independence during the pandemic, despite the Scottish Government pausing all work on independence during this pandemic, while, at the same time as others have pointed out, the UK Government has persisted without delay with their damaging Brexit obsession. To the Tories, political discussion about independence is described as reckless and damaging, but apparently Brexit not so much. Democracy is reckless and damaging, but it appears only when it applies to Scotland's future. The true impact of Brexit is now beginning to be felt, adding further pressure and challenges to our economy already impacted by the pandemic. In 2014, the Tories told us the only way to protect Scotland's place in Europe was to vote no. In 2016, Scotland voted to remain in the EU, yet our voice was ignored. These broken promises and the material changes have led to renewed calls for a referendum on independence. The Tories seem to believe that it's only the SNP calling for this referendum, but poll after poll shows that the Scottish people want to have the choice about their own future, and the Scottish people deserve the right to choose their future. Their voices must and will be heard, and the SNP has been clear that at the next election there will be a commitment to hold a legal referendum after the pandemic. That is democracy. The focus of the Scottish Government has been completely on dealing with this pandemic, and in truth, the opposition know this to be the case. Today's motion would seek to deny Scots the right to self-determination, the right to debate the merits or not as they see them of independence, and that is simply undemocratic and unsustainable. And I'll end on this point. Having the powers of independence and full powers in this Parliament is not some abstract concept. Because in recovering from this pandemic, having control over the economy and things like welfare will be fundamental to make sure that our recovery from this pandemic is fair and socially just. I urge members to support the Scottish Government amendment.
Thank you very much. I call Alex Rowley to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, I want to begin by recognising the massive challenges that our country is facing at the current time, and the incredible pressure that individuals and families are living under with a very constant threat of a public health pandemic that today has killed more than 100,000 people across the United Kingdom and has saw unemployment rising at a rate not experienced in decades. Businesses up and down our country are in serious trouble and struggling to stay afloat, and people are worried sick about the prospect for the future, not knowing if they will be in a job next week or next month. Against that backdrop, we have to hope that the vaccine, and I am 100% behind the government in getting the vaccine rolled out as quickly as possible. As Monica Lennon said, our #1 priority is getting the vaccine to as many people as we can, as quickly as we can, and that is the key point of our amendment today. We also make clear in our amendment that there must be more work done on the exit strategy. A few weeks ago, I asked the First Minister about the exit strategy, and she told me that the exit strategy is the vaccine. I'm not so sure. I would not want us as a country to put all our hope in one basket. Indeed, going forward, we still do not know much about the effectiveness of the vaccines and the mutations of this virus. New strains of the virus are emerging that scientists are worried the vaccines will not be effective against. That is why we need an effective plan for exiting the lockdown that learns from the last one, does not have us eating out to spread new variants of the virus, that locks down our borders and enforces basic rules whilst operating the most effective test, trace and isolate programme that can be put in place. We must be able to suppress the virus, something that today the UK Government has failed to do and something today that the Scottish Government has failed to do. And that is why we are amongst the worst countries in Europe when it comes to COVID death rates. That is also why Scottish Labour believes that the Scottish Government launching a campaign and planning an independence referendum in 2021, whilst our country, the people of our country, are facing such difficult times, is not only irresponsible, it beggars belief, and it must be called out for what it is. So no matter your view on the constitutional future of our country, now is not the time, and the silent majority must be able to speak out and encouraged to speak out to such crass incompetence and hypocrisy from this SNP government. The public health crisis is deepening. Our NHS cannot cope as waiting lists grow. Masses of businesses and jobs are shut down. Our elderly are terrified in their own homes, and tens of thousands more people are relying on charity for food. And the SNP answer: hold an independence referendum. It is not acceptable, I believe, to the large majority of the population who want this government to focus on the crisis that we are in. On the question of the Constitution, Presiding Officer, I want to be clear. The Scottish Labour Party believes and has set out it is the sovereign right of the people of Scotland to determine their own future, and the right of the people of Scotland to determine the form of government suited to their needs. Of that, there should be no doubt. But I just ask SNP ministers to listen to the people, face up to your responsibilities, recognise that we are not doing as well trying to tackle this virus as we should be, and make the public health crisis and the economic fallout from that the priority of government until we get through this uncertain and very worrying time. If you are listening to the people, then that is where the majority of the people are at. You know, I pose the question, why on earth would anyone want to politicise this COVID period? Why on earth would you take your focus off COVID and try and have a debate on the Constitution? Why would you want to divide people and divide communities at a time when we need the whole country to come together? Why, oh why? And, Presiding Officer, the Tories are as equally guilty of diversion. We are told that the worst UK Prime Minister ever, Boris Johnson, is heading to Scotland this week to stoke the flames of division. What is it that he and his cronies do not understand about this crisis? So we should tell Johnson to stay away. Support the amendment and focus all our time, all our efforts on tackling the public health crisis and the economic fallout that our country is facing. Thank you.
Stuart McMillan, please, followed by Rachel Hamilton. Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, first of all, I agree with colleagues and earlier comments about the sad deaths of over 100,000 UK citizens due to COVID. With every death, there are families mourning and communities hurting, and I also add my condolences to them. It's therefore important that we do pull together across the Chamber, across the 4 nations, across the European continent, and also globally to deliver the vaccines to help get society back to a better place. That will certainly help the economy also, notwithstanding hard Brexit that we're now dealing with. I believe that independence is actually part of the recovery from COVID and also Brexit. And I also believe that it's right for a referendum to make Scotland the country we want it to be. And now that Labour and the Lib Dems have signed up fully to Brexit and rejected rejoining the European Union along with their Tory colleagues, it's then clear that economic recovery lies with independence and rejoining the European Union. Presiding Officer, it sadly hasn't taken long for the Tories to actually bring the Constitution into the vaccine rollout. Daily and for months, the First Minister has stood in front of the media corps and rejected constitutional questions, quite rightly so. But sadly, this week, the Tory Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, couldn't do likewise. Now, previously, there was also the nonsense about putting a Union flag on the Oxford AstraZeneca boxes. Now, I didn't see any campaigning to get the Turkish, the German or the Belgian flags on the Pfizer boxes, and nor should we have. Brian Whittle actually touched upon the First Minister's comments in the briefings earlier in his contribution, and he was correct that the First Minister has focused on COVID and not on an independence referendum, and I'm pleased that he recognises that. COVID is a global pandemic, and any narrow nationalism offered by the UK government is unwarranted and, quite frankly, appalling. The countries should be working together, and it has been the case in the main so far, and it must continue. But that's why I do welcome the fact that all 4 nations in the UK are working to the same target of completing the vaccination of the GCVI priority groups 1 and 2, and then by mid-February, groups 1, 2, 3 and 4. And by early May, everybody on the GCVI priority list, including those who are over 50 and younger people with underlying health conditions, will be vaccinated. And the Scottish Government has provided Parliament with regular updates, and this will continue, and this is the correct course of action. But one thing is certain, though, that we may be going about it in a slightly different order, but we are all following the same targets. I'm saying also it's astounding to think that the Tories today are trying to place false differences between the 4 nations of the UK, and they really should consider their actions. I believe it's important to highlight just a deal of what's going on with the vaccination programme. I'll just touch upon just a few of the things that are happening. The GCVI has advised that an age-based programme, as they believe it will likely result in the faster delivery and better uptake in those at the highest risk. Also, the Scottish Government's aim is that have 400,000 vaccinations to be taking place in Scotland every week from the end of February. And also it's aiming to vaccinate people aged 70 and over by the middle of February. And those aged over 65 and those who are clinically extremely vulnerable will receive their first doses by the beginning of March. And this period also covers all priority groups 1 to 5 on the GCVI list, which is just over 1.4 million people. Now, there are many other aspects that are going on, but certainly one final point is that large centres will be capable of delivering in excess of 20,000 vaccinations per week. Now, clearly, this is a task on a mammoth scale, and I really support all the actions of everyone who's delivering this day in, day out, as well as the organisation behind it. On the issue of a referendum, it's up to the people of Scotland to decide our future. Discussions about a referendum are clearly important, but what is absolutely not for discussion is the fact that Scotland votes for a legal referendum on the 6th of May this year, then that's what it will get. Now, I firmly believe that Scotland's referendum must be beyond any legal challenge to ensure legitimacy and also acceptance at home, but also abroad. And this is surely the best way to becoming an independent country. And that's why that the SNP are going to seek the authority of the Scottish people for that referendum in May. A legal referendum to give the people of Scotland the right to choose a better future after the pandemic, and that's crucial, after the pandemic, in the first part of the parliamentary term. Fundamentally, Presiding Officer, it's not about what Boris Johnson wants, it's about what the people of Scotland want. And the increasing evidence is that they want independence. Opposition parties clearly have a right to oppose independence, but they certainly do not have the right to deny the people of Scotland the chance to determine their own future. The Tories clearly are utterly terrified of the verdict of the people of Scotland, but this Trump-like attempt to deny the results of a free and fair election will not be accepted by the Scottish electorate. I think it's also astonishing that what is left of the anti-independence campaign are still peddling some of the nonsense and backtracking every turn, even after the list of broken promises and whoppers has been laid bare for all to see. Day in, day out, MSPs quite rightly ask this Scottish Government of what they're going to do on a wide range of issues. Therefore, I think it's quite embarrassing that some politicians don't want the SNP government to actually undertake that activity. The fact of 20 opinion polls highlighting and supporting independence, it's something that the population are talking about, and it's something that clearly is an issue for them. As an Presiding Officer, it's been obvious for many, many years that the Labour Party are utterly incapable of offering any solutions or vision for Scotland. So they've resorted to, once again, telling a lot of nonsense. But, Presiding Officer, I'm conscious that I know that the population of Scotland do want a referendum. They want it after the pandemic. And the actions of the Scottish Government are very important, and I certainly do support the amendment in the name of the Scottish Government today. Thank you.
I'm going to have to ask members to be a bit more cognisant of the time they're taking. We're running short, and I now call Rachel Hamilton to be followed by Emma Harper.
Thank you. Firstly, I would like to reiterate my party's thanks to all key workers and frontline health workers. Presiding Officer, I am shocked and astounded by the reckless tone of the SNP motion in the name of Mike Russell. We are in the middle of a pandemic. We are at the heart of a public health and economic crisis, and the Nationalist top priority is independence. Colleagues across this chamber are rightly surprised by the negligent and time-wasting constitutional drum-banging. Meanwhile, small businesses go wanting, young people are left behind, and elderly people wait in desperation for a vaccine. The Labour and Liberal Democrats agree with all of these points, and I urge them to support our motion tonight. The United Kingdom has been devastated by this ravaging and virulent pandemic. The most vulnerable in our society have been adversely affected by the disease, and we, the elected members of the Parliament, have a duty to the people of Scotland. We have a duty to our country. Yet, the party in government, the SNP democracy deniers, are distracting from their duty to put the pandemic recovery first, rather than pursuing their own goal of separatism. Presiding Officer, I must get the main points that I'd like to raise. Over the past few weeks, I've been moved by countless letters from worried over 80-year-olds seeking reassurance that they will shortly receive their vaccine. I do not accept the Cabinet Secretary's disgraceful comments. It is under his government's watch that they have failed older people. Furthermore, I've been contacted by small bed and breakfast business owners pleading for financial support from parents concerned that their children will be a lost generation. There are 3 areas of concern. I appreciate that the virtual nature of my contribution does not allow for debate, but perhaps the SNP would like to explain in closing why on these issues they have failed so badly. Firstly, the vaccination. As my colleague Donald Cameron said, we are simply not going fast enough. The number of vaccinations at just 24,192 daily has declined from the peaks of last week's figure. Nicola Sturgeon spoke of ramping up the vaccine rollout, yet we see progress stalling. We're hardly firing on all cylinders in Scotland, unlike other parts of the UK where they are racing ahead. We could have seen more mass vaccination centres, a streamlined vaccination application process, and better coordination from this government. And what about supply? Reports yesterday said the UK government has supplied nearly 1 million vaccine doses in total to the Scottish government, of which the SNP have used just 462,000, just under half, leaving around 500,000 in storage. This is quite frankly a shambles. Everyone stands ready except this government, who seem more concerned with the colour of an envelope than the rate of vaccination. NHS staff, volunteers, our armed forces are working hard to deploy the vaccine, but this government just can't get the job done. On that point, can somebody answer why has the Scottish government snubbed the offer of more help from the British Army? Presiding officer, our economic recovery depends on Scots having the vaccine sooner rather than later. Delay and dither will be to the detriment of those currently further down the JCVI priority group list. I think colleagues here today will see through why the SNP have launched an 11-point plan on IndyRef2. My party were not surprised by the timing of this predictable distraction. However, families with children, grandparents and young people are asking, why not an 11-point plan on education, on health, on any domestic matter which the government has control over? What about an 11-point plan to restart the economy and promote a robust recovery? Patrick Harvey is entirely wrong when he says the UK government has contempt for the Scottish government. Far from it. It has shown that what we can do as a family of nations with the furlough scheme, the business bounce back loans and 8.6 billion of upfront funding for Scotland. However, here in Scotland, some businesses are still waiting for that funding, the funding that they deserve. They've not received a single penny since this begun. We have on numerous occasions called on the SNP to listen to business. For example, the traditional self-catering industry has been a mainstay of Scotland's tourism offering for a generation, yet has not been granted the support it deserves by this government. Problems were evident from the very outset during the first lockdown, as many were deemed ineligible for grants. Self-catering once again proved their value to our tourist economy by leading the way with the reopening of tourist accommodation in the summer using government-backed cleaning protocols. But once restrictions were tightened from the autumn onwards, many were again left without support. Larger providers have been left with nothing since September 2020, and it's still unclear when the funds from the 7 million self-catering grant announced in December 2020 will make their way into operator bank accounts. The Scottish Government has consistently overlooked, undervalued and excluded this key sector, again evidenced by the recent decision to exclude self-catering operators from the hospitality top-up funding, when they should be consistently backing business which will form an integral part of the eventual recovery of Scottish tourism. Right now, we need to see the SNP government building up, not breaking up the UK. As part of that 11-point plan for the economy, we could have seen an extension to 100% relief for non-domestic rates for hospitality and tourism businesses. And I do draw members' attention to my register of interests on that point. Perhaps the Swedish-style job council suggested by the Scottish Conservatives. In conclusion, Nicola Sturgeon said, independence transcends everything. Well, the SNP should be ashamed that it is taking our beloved country to Groundhog Day again. First Minister must pull up her sleeves and commit to rebuilding Scotland as part of the United Kingdom. Thank you.
Emma Harper, please, followed by George Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was saddened to hear that 100,000 people have now lost their lives to this virus. And I want to take this opportunity to offer my thanks to all health and care workers across Scotland for their efforts to stop the spread of the virus and to treat those who have COVID-19. They have been working above and beyond the call of duty, doing extra shifts and weekend shifts, and they must be commended. Presiding Officer, I refer members to my register of interest. I'm a registered nurse, and over the Christmas recess, I completed the required training and returned to work as a member of NHS Dumfries and Galloway's vaccination team. I've injected into the arms of folk from Stranraer to Dumfries, and I will continue to help as much as I can as needed. The pandemic is the overriding priority at the moment. And I have been on the front line of the pandemic, and everyone that I speak to knows the pandemic is the top priority. And Stuart McMillan's right when he says that the First Minister has repeatedly at the briefing said the pandemic is the top priority. We also do need to plan for the future, though, for when the pandemic is over. And we need to plan and prepare to repair the damage that the Westminster Conservatives' dithering has caused in the pandemic and Brexit. And Michael Russell has outlined the issues of Erasmus and the Brexit damage to our economy. So we do need to plan for the future. Planning is proper. The Conservatives had 4.5 years to plan for how we were going to leave the EU, and they parried and they dawdled and they delayed, all for 4.5 years, until Christmas Eve, when they had to agree to a really bad deal. The Conservatives' Fisheries Minister didn't even read the Brexit deal on Christmas Eve because she was too busy with a nativity trail. Planning for the future is necessary. 2 businesses in my South Scotland region have suffered due to the lack of Brexit planning by Westminster Conservatives. The Ethical Dairy are no longer going to ship their artisan cheese to Northern Ireland due to the lack of planning by the UK government and their lack of communication with businesses. And West Coast Sea Products in Kirkcudbright, a huge local employer, has had major challenges due to tax registration requirement to ship their much prized scallops to France. That's what lack of planning results in. Presiding Officer, I also want to comment on Monica Lennon's amendment demanding urgently introducing 24/7 vaccinations. Personally, I question this suggestion. It might be very irresponsible and actually dangerous. I am in a unique position to give the Chamber an update on the front line of the vaccination programme. My experience may not be the same as other vaccinators, but I think it would be useful to share my frontline experience. The vaccination team I have worked with are about 50% made up of nurses, physios, OTs and podiatrists who are already working full-time in NHS jobs. And the other 50% of the team is retired nurses and midwives who have come out of retirement to help. Everyone is putting in long hours, extra shifts and weekend shifts. And now Monica Lennon wants them to stay up all night long. Obviously, there are challenges with rolling out the vaccines. There are complexities of supply chains, rurality, and the need to have safety at the forefront of vaccine injections. And I know that more advance notice of vaccine vials and intended delivery has been highlighted to me by one of our local GPs. So of course there are challenges, but 24,000 first doses have been injected. We have had extra clinics, we have had extra shifts, and now we're doing back shifts and weekends. The speed up language is an attack on frontline workers, frontline vaccinators, and it's not helping. The professional team that I belong to are competent and safely vaccinating at the pace required. I spoke to an A&E surgeon who works in Glasgow who said that doing vaccines in the middle of the night might be helpful in large population centres like Glasgow, but he suggested it wouldn't work everywhere else. And I have to ask, where will the staff come from? Need to remind the Chamber that because of Brexit, the UK has lost thousands of EU nurses, and because of the UK's anti-immigration immigration policies, it's very difficult to attract nurses to move to Scotland. Additionally, how will a single parent go to a vaccine appointment at 3 o'clock in the morning? And how many women will want to travel alone in the middle of the night to get a vaccine? I encourage my colleagues to vote against Monica Lennon's Ivory Tower amendment. The Cabinet Secretary is right to highlight democracy. Planning for Scotland's recovery needs to be in the hands of Scottish people. This is about choice. This is about planning and democracy. Nobody's saying we're having a referendum the morn. Boris Johnson should take note of what happened to his pal, President Trump, when he rejected democracy. Presiding Officer, any normal government should be commended for planning and not condemned. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I offer my apologies to Mr Lockhead and Mr Adam for sending confused messages? Apologies. And we now have George Adam, followed by Neil Finlay.
Apologies accepted, Presiding Officer. I'll just get that in first. Presiding Officer, I know we say this all the time, but we do live in very strange and difficult times. Who'd have thought we'd have been living the way we are at the moment, even this time last year? And I was talking with a friend of mine recently about the COVID death figures, and I was struck at how easy it was for us to talk about these numbers as if it was just a string of numbers, as opposed to someone who was a family member, someone who was loved by someone and someone who loved themselves. And I think for us, we need to just remember that all the time when we're having these debates here or anywhere else. And how we deal with this pandemic now and in the future is an important part of this debate. And we may disagree, but we need to show here from this place leadership. It has to be shown for us all, because we must ease the fears of those that we represent, not stoke them up higher. And it goes without saying that tackling COVID-19 as safely and as efficiently as possible is the Scottish Government's top priority. To say otherwise is churlish, petty and just plainly inaccurate. But how we create the economic recovery in the future is a debate that has to be had. How we move forward as a nation is important. And it comes as some irony to me that the Tory party have brought this motion to Parliament today, when their own colleagues in Westminster have certainly left a lot to be desired in their handling of the coronavirus and subsequent difficulties the virus have brought for people. However, since the beginning of this pandemic, I've been one that's believed that we should never use COVID-19 in any political way, and I will continue that way today, because too many people are struggling through grief, financial instability and personal hardships right now. So it's important that we, as their representatives, focus on what we can do to help our constituents and lead them through these challenges. One of the beacons of light currently, Presiding Officer, is giving people confidence that there will be an end to this and everyday restrictions that we currently live under, is the creation and the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine. Science and all those in research and development have quite literally given us hope as we starting our journey that will eventually allow us to return to some form of normality. While the vaccination programme being implemented across Scotland right now follows the independent advice received by the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, the Scottish Government is delivering the vaccine as quickly as possible and is making the best use of supply available. And I think the statistics speak for themselves when you look at how priority groups have already been vaccinated. And moving forward, the Scottish Government aims at least to have 400,000 vaccinations will be taking place in Scotland every week from the end of February. And that, by early May, everybody in the JICVI priority list, including those of us that are over 50 and younger people who have underlying health conditions, will be vaccinated. These numbers certainly suggest the Government is making vaccination a top priority. And it's simply wrong to suggest that giving people of Scotland a choice in how they would wish to proceed as a nation will be a barrier to a safe and effective vaccination programme, because that is clearly, Presiding Officer, not the case. The Tories claim that everything will be neglected, and one of the things they can claim about is the fact that because our constituents won't be given the right to choose their way forward. Economic recovery is another one, but both during and after the pandemic, we have found that it's our tethers to the United Kingdom and this Westminster Government that has hindered Scotland's economic recovery and priority thus far. The damaging effects of Boris Johnson's extreme Brexit, something we in Scotland did not vote for, will be seen for what it is actually for a long time yet. And the Tories, during this whole process, as has been said by others, felt it was just to carry on to drag us out of EU right in the middle of a pandemic and a global economic recession. After this is after we have had to weather 10 years of Westminster cuts and austerity and seen Scotland ignored, completely left out of any discussions or decisions. We may have been completely ignored by Westminster throughout the Brexit process, but we do not have to sit back and blindly accept the Tory Brexit decline. The people of Scotland have the right to determine their own future and protect the interests of themselves and their community with independence. Presiding Officer, independence is essential to give our constituents the opportunity to build a fairer, more prosperous country we all want to see. And if the SNPs return to office in the upcoming Scottish parliamentary elections in May, the SNP have said, and there is a pro-independence majority in Holyrood, there can be no democratic or moral justification whatsoever to deny people their democratic right to choose a better future. The Tories accuse us of scaremongering over warnings that our fishing communities would be sold out and that workers' rights in the last minute NHS protections would be under threat and that our economy would be left worse off if the transition period was not extended beyond the pandemic. Yet now all these Tory broken promises have been utterly exposed. Scotland has the right to be treated as an equal partner. Scotland has the right, should it wish, to be an independent nation. Presiding Officer, I will always advocate for my friends and neighbours to have the democratic right to choose their way forward, a better way forward, and move away from the current UK regime that is not working, actually hindering our ability to succeed. Ultimately, Scotland's future is not about Boris Johnson, Michael Gove or Gordon Brown, what they want or what they think is the best for us. It's what the people of Scotland want, and the increasing evidence is that they want independence. So that's what the SNP will allow the people to do if re-elected in May. Above all, the Scottish Government's priority is to ensure the best for our country, which is why I have no doubt the First Minister and the SNP Government will continue to combat this current threat as effectively as they have been doing since the beginning of the pandemic. But I will add that we will give the people of Scotland the opportunity to decide their own future and their own destiny.
We have 3 minutes from Mr Finlay, please, and then Richard Lyle will be the last speaker in the open debate.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I hope the Tories would have some humility today with 100,000 of our citizens dead. It's my view that the Scottish people do have the right to self-determination. If the people want a referendum, then so be it. But that referendum should be a multi-option one, and I'll take part in it positively, making the argument for Devo Max. But with 7,000 Scots dead, I have to ask the Government if a referendum really is their priority. If you speak to people in working class communities that have suffered most from COVID, you will hear how shattered people are, absolutely shattered, economically broken, with cuts to already low pay, cuts to hours worked, unemployment, others seeing their bosses at British Gas and Tesco and Wilco exploiting the crisis to slash pay and conditions. Food bank use is up 47%. Can you imagine what it's like to look at your children every day, wondering how you'll put food in their mouths and hearing that lockdown has been extended again? There's a mental health crisis. Young people full of energy and vitality have been cooped up, unable to meet their pals, missing out on the structure of a school day, and their education is suffering, unable to enjoy the liberty of being young, and their mental health is suffering. They need help. There's a physical health crisis. People have stopped going to their GP, they've stopped going for a smear test or a breast screening appointment, storing up a huge backlog of cases and people who need treatment, diagnostic tests, operations and care. There's an elderly crisis with the human rights scandal in our care homes ongoing, a social care crisis there before COVID but exacerbated by it, a staffing crisis where health and council staff and service workers and others who've been in the front line for a year without any real break are exhausted and traumatised by the experience. They need a rest. There's a crisis of confidence with people afraid and scared. They need reassurance and certainty to rebuild their confidence, their businesses, their relationships and their families. There is a coming housing crisis because when lockdown is lifted, there will be evictions and homelessness and repossessions. They will return unless there is direct and huge intervention. There is an emotional crisis, especially those who have lost a loved one. People who have been able to give them a dignified and fitting funeral. How will they ever get rid of the haunting image of going to a funeral or cremation with only a handful of mourners there? These people haven't been able to mourn properly. They haven't been able to get together and share stories and memories and visit graves and scatter ashes and do all the things we naturally do when a loved one dies. Presiding Officer, I've only scratched the surface of the 1,000,001 crises that are out there in our society. I have to say to the Government, put yourself in the place of a young single mum trying to cope, or in the shoes of an 8-year-old wife of a dementia sufferer who hasn't seen her husband for a year, or in the place of an NHS worker who has had to deal with the sick and dying whilst putting their own life at risk every single day, and ask yourself, is their priority an independence referendum, or is it to rebuild the country socially, economically, physically, mentally and emotionally? They desperately need all the time, energy and money of government to go back into rebuilding, and when that's addressed, Let's get on to discussing our constitutional future.
Richard Lyle is the last contributor in the open debate. Mr Lyle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The COVID-19 pandemic, as our First Minister has said, is the overriding priority of this SNP for its government, of its ministers, and in my view as a parliamentarian, a priority for us all. My heart goes out to those who have suffered the loss. None of what is said in this debate today will detract from the mission of government to continue to steer our country through this pandemic, to deliver the vaccines to the population and communities across Scotland, and to build a recovery that is fair and delivers for all. But we must be clear that when this pandemic subsides, it is the people of Scotland who must have the right to decide how best to rebuild our country. Not Boris Johnson, nor any Westminster governments we don't elect will have the right to decide the kind of country we should have as we recover from the pandemic. It is for Scotland's people to decide that. Presiding Officer, time and time again, the people of Scotland are being ignored by Westminster Tories and the branch offices of the unionist parties in Scotland as they continue to support that position. From our overwhelming vote to remain in the EU, now our views being ignored. A far harder Brexit that could have been imagined when the EU referendum took place, damaging and disrupting this country's economy and society at the worst possible time. And yet here we are. The Scottish Government is doing everything it can to mitigate against the consequences of the UK Government's actions, but it can't avert every negative outcome. It's a compounding problem because we know that businesses are already struggling under the burden of COVID-19 and are now faced with the additional burden of Brexit. Indeed, the Tory Government is willfully damaging people's jobs, businesses and the economy at the worst possible time during a global pandemic and economic recession. And with each and every day that goes by, more devastating details emerge of the long-term damage this hard Tory Brexit will do to people's incomes, living standards and our economy. So I say again, the people of Scotland, not Westminster, we don't elect, will have the right to decide the kind of country we should have as we recover from the pandemic. Presiding Officer, I want to highlight something today, because I know that we have all heard and will hear today from other parties the focus should not be on independence and how it can be used to recover from the pandemic, but rather we should forget the whole idea. And yet we look upon the actions of other parties across the chamber, and I must say, Presiding Officer, hypocrisy is on display, whether it be in the blue corner, the red corner, or even the Wally Rennie corner. Because the SNP as a party have been talking about Scotland having the right to choose how it recovers after the pandemic, whilst the SNP and government tackle the pandemic now. In contrast, we have the Westminster Tory government and its unquestioning party in Scotland pushing through Brexit with little preparation in the middle of this pandemic. We have Labour demanding and voting for the Westminster government to push through Brexit with little preparation in the middle of the pandemic. And then you have the Lib Dems meekly accepting the Tories pushing through Brexit with little preparation in the middle of the pandemic. Their argument is not just hypocritical and double standards, it's downright irresponsible, and we're having none of it. Presiding Officer, in the time I have left, I want to recognise and focus on the latter elements of the Tory motion, because it's right we talk about COVID-19 vaccination progress. I got my letter yesterday. I am over 70. I will be going for my vaccination. I encourage everyone else to do so. And I want to take the opportunity to thank the Minister and all the Ministers in Government for the work they've done and continue to do during the pandemic, not least in all on the COVID-19 vaccine programme. Because the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine is the biggest and undoubtedly the most significant logistical operation in Scotland's post-war history. Whilst this is obviously a very welcome milestone in their collective fight against the pandemic, and I'm very grateful to all those who have worked so hard to ensure Scotland is ready to deliver those COVID-19 vaccinations, there should be no doubt as to the challenge. Science has given us a hope. We're making progress on our journey, which will eventually allow us to return to lives we want to lead. But I have to say this to those in the opposition benches. This SNP government and our vaccination programme will follow the independent advice received from the Joint Committee on the vaccination and immunisation. It recommends prioritising those with the greatest clinical need. We'll continue to follow the science as we've done through the pandemic, and progress is being made. This SNP Scottish Government hope to have vaccinations, all those on the JCVI priority list by the end of spring 2021. Vaccine supplies permitting and progress is underway. The Scottish Government continues to ensure that it's rolled out as quickly and effectively as possible. And that's what a responsible government should do, and that's exactly what is happening. So far cry from the manufacturer grievance and comparisons of England versus Scotland on the COVID-19 vaccination figures. The reality is we are following the JCVI prioritisation and getting the vaccine to the most vulnerable and doing so quickly. I want to end again by paying tribute to all those, not only on the government presiding officer, but those across health and social care. They're the real people in the front line, caring for those with COVID, delivering the vaccines and providing the support. They are to be thanked. I want my final words in this debate to be for them. Thank you for what you've done, what you're doing, and what you will continue to do to help us keep safe and bring on that normality that step closer. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Now move to the closing speeches. Now call Anna Sarwar for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I feel the need to remind the Chamber that last night we got the devastating news that 100,000 of our fellow citizens have lost their life in this COVID pandemic. 100,000. That's 100,000 families devastated by this COVID crisis, and lives and livelihoods are still at risk. And what the public expect their Parliament to do and their elected representatives to do is to actually pull together in the heat of this crisis and actually fight against this virus. Lives and livelihoods are still at risk and will still be at risk for many, many more months to come. The idea that any of us are debating anything else apart from COVID-19 will seem ridiculous to the families devastated by this crisis. And I want to send out my heartfelt condolences to all those people that have lost a loved one in this crisis. We've all been touched in our own individual ways, but everyone that's lost someone directly, a sincere and heartfelt condolence. And also a huge thank you to all our frontline NHS and care staff, all those retail workers and all those involved in food production and food delivery that really are keeping our country going. It's those people and their lives that we should be debating and discussing in this Parliament, not powers or not petty party politics. People expect us to come to this Parliament, to work together, to challenge, to scrutinise and to respond to this crisis. And that's what I want to focus the majority of my contribution on. The collective focus should be on virus suppression. What the government should be doing is how we bring down this virus. And there's three parts to that virus suppression strategy. One part is the restrictions, second is the testing, and third, the tracing. And I'll come on to the vaccine in a moment. But suppression is restrictions, testing and tracing. Yes, it's the First Minister and the government that announces the restrictions, but actually the responsibility for living those restrictions and implementing those restrictions is the people's responsibility. And I think the vast majority of our citizens have followed the restrictions in their role in trying to suppress this virus. But the two parts that the government is responsible for, the testing system and the tracing system, 11 months on, is simply not good enough. Willie Rennie mentioned this, that only a fraction of our testing capacity is being used every single day. Where is that mass testing programme that we were promised 11 months ago? Where is that mass testing programme so we can actually find the virus, hunt down the virus, and then help to suppress the virus? Why are we still failing on our tracing system so we can isolate where those viruses are and help to bring that virus spread down? We were promised that the last lockdown was, yes, about saving the NHS, yes, was about saving lives, yes, was about suppressing the virus, but it was also in order to give us time to build the systems, the testing system and the tracing system, so we could avoid going into lockdown again. That patently failed, and it's still not good enough. and still failing far too many people. I know, for example, of home carers in Glasgow who still aren't being tested every single week and are being forced to go into COVID-positive homes in order to do their job. So that's the virus suppression part. The virus elimination part is the vaccine. And what we need is a mass mobilisation effort if we are going to deliver this vaccination across the country, because that's the way we get out of this crisis. And I welcome the pledge of the government, or the ambition of the government, to have 400,000 vaccinations a week. But if we're honest, we're nowhere near reaching that ambition of 400,000 vaccinations a week. And if we are going to get 400,000 vaccinations a week, it needs a mass mobilisation effort that works on the NHS staff, that brings together our armed forces, but also vaccination centres and a mass mobilisation of volunteers. And I'm sorry to say to Emma Harper, that also means 24/7 vaccinations too. That doesn't mean NHS staff work 24/7. People work shifts. It's that the NHS works 24/7 so we can actually vaccinate our way out of this crisis. And I'm sorry to those people that think that talking about an independence referendum right now is the right way forward. An independence referendum and independence is not a light switch moment. We don't just one day say we're going to have a referendum or we'll have independence and that's it, the process is over. It takes energy, it takes capacity. It takes ministers' capacity, it takes civil servants' capacity as well. Wouldn't we all wish that that capacity was all being used on our COVID recovery, suppressing this virus and getting people back to work? That's what this should be all about. And I would much rather that all of us across this chamber, whether you are in the SNP or the Tories, in the Liberal Democrats, the Greens or the Labour Party, I would much rather that we say in the national interest, not the nationalist interest, in the national interest, we will collectively resolve to defeat this virus and to make the next Parliament a COVID recovery Parliament that focuses on our economic recovery, a jobs recovery, a climate recovery, a communities recovery, an education recovery and an NHS recovery, so we never again have to choose between treating a virus or treating cancer. That's what's expected of this Parliament from the Scottish people, and that's what they deserve from their parliamentarians.
Now call Marie Goujon for up to 7 minutes, please, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm actually really glad to follow on from that contribution from Anna Sarwar, and I really agree with a lot of the sentiments that he expressed, and would find it difficult to disagree with a lot of what he's expressed there, and absolutely get behind a lot of what he said, because I really just want to be clear from the outset of my remarks today that beating this virus is the government's priority. And right now, there's absolutely nothing that is more important to me in my job, that's more important to my colleagues right across government, than delivering this vaccination programme and ensuring that we are doing absolutely everything that we possibly can to improve people's health and to tackle the issues that we've seen arise through this pandemic. Now, there is a lot to cover today from a lot of the points that were raised in the debate, so I will try to get through as much as I possibly can. In terms of addressing the point of the Tory motion directly, and I think in particular that mention of a vaccination task force, I would just like to ask them a question. Exactly how much time and effort should the government take away from delivering the vaccination programme to finding the people to populate another group to get that body up and running? And who do they think that we should pull away from the work they're already doing in delivering this critical programme? Yes.
Dean Lockhart.
Well, perhaps part of the answer might be the resource, time and effort you're dedicating towards the Task Force for Independence. Perhaps instead of dedicating time and money for that task force, you divert that into a task force for the vaccine.
Marie Goujon.
The intervention is a complete nonsense, because all the resources, all the money and all the time is going into trying to tackle this virus, as I said when I started my comments. Now, adding another layer of groups and meetings wouldn't do anything but eat up crucial resource and focus. And by the way, we've already got something akin to a task force, even though it's not a task force by name. We're in direct daily contact with boards, we have the army involved, logistic experts, we're in regular contact with all relevant bodies. Everybody is doing what they can to make sure we get people vaccinated and to roll that out as quickly as possible. Now, we started delivering the vaccine on the 8th of December, and yesterday our management information reports that 24,192 doses were delivered, bringing the total number of people who've now received their first dose of vaccine to 462,092. No, yeah, I've already taken an intervention from the member. Thanks to the tireless work at a national and local level, this work is accelerating. And I really just want to thank all our staff and the volunteers that have been involved in delivering this, which of course involves our very own Emma Harper, our colleague who's been joining in the vaccination effort. Now, health boards are now progressing with plans to step up larger vaccination centres. This week, mass vaccination centres will open up in Dumfries and Galloway, Fife, the Western Isles and Forth Valley Health Boards. And NHS, Lanarkshire and Grampian are also planning on using mass centres from this week onward. And we're also looking at how to make the best use of centres, including a trial of 24/7 vaccination to see whether round-the-clock availability of appointments can accelerate delivery. And we're also continuing to deliver in primary care settings, and not at the moment. I really need to make some progress and look at how we support smooth supply to those settings, including GP surgeries. And that's where it has just been so frustrating and disappointing to hear the same highly misleading claims repeated here today that we've heard for the past few weeks, that Scotland's failing to make use of its supply or it's slow to deliver. It's just not the case. And the First Minister and the Cabinet Secretary have responded to this time and time again. Scotland's NHS is drawing down the supplies it needs to vaccinate the priority groups according to the JCVI priority list, and we have a plan for every single vaccination allocated to us. And we are still on track to meet our targets in the coming weeks. Yes.
Willie Rennie.
The Minister just clear it up then. How many vaccines do we actually have in storage?
Marie Goujon.
I'm actually very glad that the member asked that question, since a point that he continually likes to raise, as well as other members. We, in the Scottish Government, would absolutely love to publish the figures, which would not only show how much has been allocated to Scotland, but also show that the vast majority of that supply is either already in people's arms or has been drawn down by health boards and sent to GPs to vaccinate people in the coming days. We don't sit on supply. The UK Government has asked us not to publish that information. We agreed that in good faith with them. Well, if they're telling you the figures, it would be nice if they allowed us to actually publish them. And we're looking at ways to make that information available publicly and transparently to all. And again, we've stood by that agreement and they are not willing to do the same. No, I need to make some progress. Now, our focus is exactly where it needs to be, and that's dealing with the pandemic. But there's also parts of this debate today that I just can't lie unchallenged. Now, Donald Cameron talked about how it was unfathomable and unforgivable to discuss anything else other than the pandemic. I think that's absolutely true at this point. And Brian Whittle also said that we can't or shouldn't be doing anything else but focus on the pandemic. Well, it's a shame that the Tories didn't care about the impact to businesses, the impact to our economy, when they decided to plough on with leaving the EU right in the middle of the pandemic, ignoring every single plea about business readiness, preparedness, and now we're seeing and having to deal with the fallout from that, whether that's from seed potatoes, whether it's the fishing industry, to the businesses who are now simply giving up on trading because of the new procedures thrust on them that they had no time or warning to prepare for. No, I need to make some progress. And the Tories can say or protest all the like. The fact is, I was in those meetings with the Cabinet Secretary for the Rural Economy, Fergus Ewing, quite literally for years, outlining our significant concerns about the impact on industry in Scotland, to the extent that we had a list consisting of pages of unanswered questions that we took to every single meeting, which to this day, I don't think any of them have been answered. So I am not going to stand here and accept a lecture from them about what's reckless and damaging. But I will tell them what's reckless and damaging. A UK government that ignores the pleas of industries and businesses, and UK ministers who sign up to deals affecting those industries and businesses that they don't read because they're too busy. And a UK government that ignores migration needs of Scotland, another point highlighted by Emma Harper, to suit its own right-wing narrative. And a UK government that will quite literally not even engage with their ministerial counterparts on these issues, flat out ignoring every single repeated request to meet and discuss that. And also a UK government that actively seeks to undermine our equal partners at every turn. I gave evidence at the Health Committee yesterday on one of the proposed common frameworks, a piece of work that we engaged in, that was engaged in by all nations in good faith as a positive way of working, and a piece of work completely undermined by the biggest threat to devolution that we've seen since the creation of this Parliament in the Internal Market Act. One piece of legislation that gives the UK government the right to overrule devolved governments and unilaterally force us to accept products and standards we don't want in Scotland. So Scotland deserves more than that. Scotland deserves better than that. And that's why when it comes to the future and as we look to rebuild our country, our economy and our NHS from this crisis, the people of Scotland should be free to choose that future. And if there's a majority in the next Parliament to pursue that path, that's exactly what will happen. Thank you.
Colin Dean Lockhart to close the debate for up to 9 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Let me start by agreeing with my colleague Donald Cameron and other members in expressing condolences to every person and family devastated by the impact of the pandemic, and also to extend our thanks to the NHS and other frontline workers in Scotland for everything they do. Presiding Officer, the political differences and constitutional views of the parties in this chamber are well rehearsed. But surely, in this time of crisis, the worst public health emergency in a century, it is time to put to one side arguments over the Constitution and instead work together to fight the pandemic, vaccinate the vulnerable and rebuild our communities. And that's what our motion today is calling for the SNP to establish a task force, not for independence, but a task force to roll out the vaccine as soon as possible and to drop their plans for an unlawful and unwanted referendum. Because Presiding Officer, the SNP's plan for an unlawful, a wildcat referendum is a roadmap for ongoing constitutional conflict, not the cooperation and the unity we desperately need for Scotland to recover from the pandemic. And it's this cooperation across the UK that has delivered 1 million doses of the COVID vaccine to Scotland, a world-leading vaccination programme researched, developed and funded by the UK Government, which means that vulnerable people across Scotland have the chance of getting vaccinated before almost any other country in the world. However, Presiding Officer, as we've heard, it is a vaccination programme in which the SNP is falling seriously behind. With increasing concerns over the pace of the vaccine rollout, Donald Cameron, in his opening remarks, highlighted some of these concerns. 1 million doses of the vaccine have been delivered by the UK Government to Scotland, but less than half of these vaccines have been given. The deadline to vaccinate the over 80s has been delayed, and the BMA Scotland GP Committee has highlighted the slow rate at which vaccines are being made available to GPs. Wheeleraney mentioned the convoluted and confused supply chain used by the Scottish Government, which is no doubt a factor behind these delays. And Brian Whittle was absolutely right to say that the SNP is failing in its single most important job as Scotland's government, that is to protect the vulnerable from the pandemic. Because behind every delayed vaccine is a vulnerable person who could suffer the devastating consequences of the coronavirus as a result of these delays. And therein, Presiding Officer, lies the absolute disgrace of the SNP's decision to prioritise plans for another divisive referendum at the height of this pandemic. Because for every pound, minute, every person involved in planning another referendum is invaluable resource being diverted away from the pandemic, diverted away from the vaccination programme and diverted away from Scotland's recovery. And the SNP ministers who are now busy setting up this independence task force are the same SNP ministers who repeatedly declined our calls for a public inquiry into care home deaths, because at that time, Nicola Sturgeon said, "We've got far too many things to do to keep the system going, to keep people well." No time for a public inquiry to learn the devastating lessons of the care home crisis, but now, Presiding Officer, the SNP has found time to plan for another referendum. This tells us all we need to know about the real priorities of this SNP administration, an impression just reinforced by Mike Russell's utterly dismal opening remarks, which were just another rant on the Constitution, with not a single mention of how the SNP plans to speed up the vaccination programme. And, Presiding Officer, it's not just SNP ministers who will be dedicating time for a divisive referendum. The civil service will also be distracted from fighting the pandemic. Let me quote the advice given to the Scottish Government by the Permanent Secretary of the Civil Service, Leslie Evans. "Preparing for the referendum will require focus and careful management. We will identify where we see scope for deprioritisation of activities." So there we have it, Presiding Officer, clear and unambiguous advice from the head of the Civil Service that planning another referendum will result in government business in other areas being deprioritised. It doesn't have to be this way, Presiding Officer. Constitutional division is not the inevitable course of events. It is instead a deliberate political choice made by the SNP to pursue this division. And that's why, Presiding Officer, in our motion today, we are calling for the SNP to reverse their plans to create a task force for independence and instead, as I said to the Minister, create a task force for the vaccination programme. Every person, every pound diverted from the vaccination programme will put vulnerable people in danger. This is a task force that should make sure the vaccination is rolled out across Scotland as soon as possible. And our motion today also calls for everyone across Scotland to work together to help Scotland recover from the pandemic, because that's something the public expects political parties to do and would expect members in this chamber to do. And this has to include the SNP working constructively with the UK Government to fight the pandemic, because in the past 12 months, the UK Government has introduced a series of unprecedented measures to help Scotland tackle the pandemic. In addition to the 1 million vaccines delivered, the British Army has been deployed to assist in the rollout of the vaccination programme, helping to set up 80 vaccination centres across Scotland, yet another example of what cooperation can achieve. The UK Chancellor has delivered historic levels of spending in Scotland, close to £20 billion in total, including one of the world's most generous and effective job retention schemes, which has helped to save 1 million jobs and livelihoods across Scotland. And the Scottish budget to be announced tomorrow will be the highest ever budget since devolution as a result of this additional UK spending. As Steve Barclay said in his letter to Kate Forbes, the overwhelming majority of COVID support to business and people is and will continue to be delivered through the UK Treasury. It is disappointing that in your public comments you failed to mention the depth of support that has been provided by the UK Treasury. That is disappointing, Presiding Officer, but it's not surprising, because the SNP is not interested in working constructively with the UK Government. It is instead, as we've heard today, hell-bent on pushing their agenda for breaking up the country. I will, yes.
I'd like to ask in the terms of working constructively, as I outlined in my own remarks, that's exactly what the process we engage with the common frameworks. So maybe you'd like to tell the Chamber about why the UK Government then brought forward the Internal Market Act, which sought out to completely undermine that and overrule any of that work and that positive engagement that had been done.
Dean Lockhart.
Well, it's interesting. The Minister talks about constructive engagement on the internal market process, but the Cabinet Secretary walked out. Yeah, listen, the Cabinet Secretary walked away from the negotiations 18 months ago. What is constructive about that? Walking away from negotiations. Typical SNP. If they don't get stuff their own way, they walk away. Presiding Officer, John Swinney said last week that independence is an essential condition for Scotland to rebuild. That is fundamentally wrong. I need to make progress, sorry. It's fundamentally wrong because the SNP already have all the powers necessary for Scotland to build back from the pandemic. Powers across education, health, infrastructure, transport, social security, justice and economic development. But as Rachel Hamilton pointed out, the SNP want to distract attention away from their abysmal track record across all of these areas. Declining standards in education, which was meant to be the First Minister's #1 priority, a legacy of incompetence and failure in transport and infrastructure, with the Queensferry crossing closing every time there is a build-up of ice, and 2 ferries on the Clyde running over £200 million over budget. On the economy, the SNP has presided over the failure of BIFAB and has failed to allocate hundreds of millions of pounds to thousands of small businesses across Scotland who are on the brink of closure. And this will result in long-term scarring of the economy. In justice, we have seen the reputation of the Scottish justice system tarnished by malicious prosecutions undertaken by the Crown Office and the ongoing obstruction by the SNP in the Alex Salmond inquiry. And in health, there is a chronic mental health crisis, already a major crisis before COVID, but getting worse by the day. And the Edinburgh Sick Kids Hospital, 9 years behind schedule and still not open. Presiding Officer, these are the real priorities that people in Scotland want their government to focus on, not planning a divisive, unlawful, wildcat referendum at the expense of the health and the well-being of the people of Scotland. I support the motion in Donald Cameron's name.
That concludes the Conservative Party debate on the Scottish Government COVID-19 response. At this point, could I just ask members to bear in mind that one shouldn't cross the well of the chamber while the Parliament's in session. Thank you. And I'm now going to suspend the meeting before we move on to the next item of business, which is a committee of the whole Parliament. Therefore, this meeting of Parliament is suspended.